So they continued to do this until the individual was able to independently tack the item without a prompt. If he had an incorrect response, they did follow it with a mild no, and then just repetition of that transfer procedure. And then the tack training session ended when the subject correctly tacked all 3 objects in a row. So I could say, what is this? Binoculars. What is this? Book. What is this? Cup. And that's when it would be considered correct. Then they did man training. And we kind of talked about man training last week, so I won't go into that too much. But they would first start with a man probe for each word. And correct responses were reinforced with praise and then the presentation of the missing object. Because remember, when doing man training, you need to have an establishing operation in place for them to do the man training. If a person doesn't want a drink, then it's not going to be motivating for them to make that request during man training. And then upon the receipt of the missing object, the subject would complete the chain. And so you can see here in table 3, if the person, let's say for example, was given a 3-pronged plug and a 2-pronged socket and asked to connect them, then the individual would have to mand for the adapter. Or another example is if the subject was given a piece of wire and asked to cut it, he would then have to mand for the wire cutters and ask for them. So they had contrived establishing operations, which is something that you can also do when you go out and work clinically. A lot of times, let's just say if you're working with children, you can set it up so that maybe you give them a bowl of ice cream, but you don't give them a spoon. So that sets up that operation for them to be motivated to ask for a spoon. Or let's say that you give them a cup, but there's no drink in it, and then they have to ask you for that specific type of drink. So it's definitely possible to contrive those establishing operations and set up situations in which they're going to want the item. So this man procedure that they used was the same as Holland-Sundberg, 1987. And then they had conditioned establishing operations that were contrived by removing an item, which we had just talked about, from a stimulus array and asking the subject to complete the response chain. So they basically made it so they had a task they had to complete, but they were missing an item, and so then they had to be able to ask for that item to complete that task. And then the third type of training they did was interverbal training. And so, of course, at the beginning of each session, they did a probe for the word, and they reinforced correct responses with praise, and then incorrect responses initiated the start of the training procedure. So the interverbal training procedure was the same as Brahman Pulling, 1983, and instead of using echoic, except echoic rather than tact prompts were used, so they did use echoic prompts. Stimulus control was transferred from the echoic control to interverbal control by the use of prompting, fading, and differential reinforcement. And attempts were made to avoid the same verbal stimuli that were given during the man probes on these words, although that wasn't always possible. So basically what they did is the experimenter would present the subject with a verbal stimulus, so what to use to fix a hose on a radiator hose. And then they would reinforce correct responses. If there wasn't a response that occurred within 5 seconds, then they provided the echoic prompt. So let's say that one of the questions is, what is white? The person would have to say a cup. Another example they have here in table 4, so what do you use to pull a staple out of something? And they have to respond with a staple remover. Or if a stapler is empty, what do you need to put in it? And then they would have to respond with staples. So then they had a phase 2 for intervention, and following the successful acquisition of tacks for both subjects, the tack training condition was discontinued. Also, following the acquisition of interverbal training, interverbal training was discontinued for subject 2. The remaining conditions, the man training for both subjects and interverbal training for subject 1, were changed to tack training, and specific manned and interverbal training was discontinued. But the manned and interverbal probes were still still implemented for all of the remaining words. So overall, both subjects displayed a relatively weak tact, mand, and interverbal behavior during baseline, but then after they received the mand and the tact training and the interverbal training, they demonstrated a significant increase. And then in Figure 2 and 3, you can see the acquisition of the transfer of verbal operants trained for subjects 1 and 2. So all of the data represent performance during the probe conditions, and then you can see the shaded portions of the graphs indicate a specific training condition. The top 3 panels of both graphs show the acquisition of tacts and the effects of a specific tact training on the emergence of mand and interverbal responses. So we're going to go to, so the results of Phase 2, you can see are presented in Figures 3 and 4, and since both subjects did not effectively acquire mands during specific mand training, Subject 1 did not effectively acquire, and since Subject 1 did not effectively acquire the interverbals during a specific interverbal training, it was speculated that specific tact training would result in a similar pattern to that observed during Phase 1. And as a result, the mand and interverbal conditions were simultaneously changed to tact training for Subject 1, and the mand condition was changed to tact training for Subject 2. Training on the tacts from Set 1 was discontinued for both subjects. So for Subject 1, tact training on the words that had been previously in the interverbal condition had an immediate and robust effect on performance during the mand probes. So overall, the results of this study suggest that tact and interverbal training may be the most efficient way to generate mands for some individuals who have sustained traumatic brain injury. And direct mand training proved to be the least efficient method to produce manding, which is kind of ironic. But these results were, these results were unexpected given previous research with the developmentally disabled that had shown that mands actually were acquired faster than tacts, and that direct mand training was necessary to establish reliable manding. However, it is possible that the current data may simply demonstrate some of the differences between these two populations. So that's kind of important to note when you are choosing what type of training to use, whether you're working with somebody who has autism or a developmental disability versus working with somebody who has traumatic brain injury. So overall, these results do support Sidman et al.'s findings that there is a different recovery course for different operants. In addition, the results demonstrate the value of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior for the assessment and treatment of verbal problems faced by brain-injured individuals. And so once these verbal deficits are identified, a more efficient verbal intervention program can be designed. In addition, these results demonstrate why acquisition was so slow, and that was because the tact repertoire was missing. So this is important because often a substantial amount of the verbal intervention provided for brain-injured individuals involves interverbal training. So you want to make sure that you're incorporating all of the components. Okay, so that completes part 1 of our lecture for week 6. Have a great day.